to Right on Four Corners. I'm your host, DelSheree Gladden. I'm a USA Today bestselling author with over 30 published novels and a ninth grade English teacher. And this week I have another education professional with me on the show, Jennifer Goodland, and she's going to be talking about her book, Daniel Lee and the Idiot Who Saved America.
I'm Jennifer Goodland. I am a professional nerd. I'm one of the reference and instruction librarians here at Juan College, and I have a background in international relations analysis, as well as a master's degree in United States history from the University of Colorado, Denver.
Tell us a little bit about Daniel Lee.
Daniel Lee was a somewhat random private in the 1st New York Regiment during the American Revolutionary War. And I discovered him because I was researching New York State land fraud perpetrated by a man named Evander Childs Sr., and I'm writing a series of books about the various schemes and cons that this man pulled, some of which were actually for a quite noble purpose. One of the land pensions that Evander Childs used was Daniel Lee's. Daniel Lee earned a land patent, land to be named later, in what's called the Military Tract of Central New York as a result of his service in the Revolutionary War. And most of the soldiers and veterans decided not to actually settle in the tract. It was an option for them to sell the tract on at a discounted price to a land speculator, a real estate broker, which Evander Childs, that was one of his roles. Evander Childs then sold the tract on to a man named James L. Bogart, who was a cartman in New York City at the time, and a cartman was somebody who moved goods, basically a freighter. One thing that we may not understand in the modern day is that freighters and cartmen in New York City had immense social and political and economic power, but they didn't tend to own land. And in New York, in the very first elections in New York State, you had to own a certain amount of land to be allowed to vote. So Evander Childs sold this land, Daniel Lee's land, onto James L. Bogart so that Bogart could vote in the election. And this was a really popular scheme. Evander Childs' office was across the street from City Hall in New York. So somebody like Bogart would go into City Hall, and City Hall would say, you can't vote, you don't have enough land. And then Bogart would go across the street to the Childs' office, which was in a tavern, which I love. Then he would say, okay, I need land so I can vote. And then Childs would write out a little deed and send it to Bogart, and then Bogart would take the deed back across the street to City Hall and say, hey, I own land now, I can vote. And it was really cheap to do because they weren't really buying it, they were essentially just renting it. So there wasn't a whole lot of oversight in this process, a lot of corruption, but in essence what Childs is doing, using land that belonged to the veterans, is that he's allowing the veterans their own money so that they can set up at a farm somewhere else. Lee eventually chose to move on to what is now West Virginia. And then on the other end of that transaction, he's running a con to allow more people to vote. And in New York State, in the very first elections, voter turnout exceeded 100%. Now, I am not a mathematician, so I have no idea as to whether or not that's valid.
Seems there might be a few questions.
But nobody ever got caught doing this. And I think it's because voting laws in New York State were the strictest in the country. So they knew that there was something wrong with the system. There wasn't a whole lot of motivation to fix it. The same people who write the laws were also the same people who are profiting from the fraud. It falls into what I like to call useful fraud, which is a key part of how the country itself took shape. What kinds of fraud exists because there's something deficient in how the country is being run? Fraud in the early national period is about people basically telling the government, we think it should work this way. There's no pathway to do this legally. There's no law that's set up to help us, for example, get voting rights the right way. So we're going to use fraud to do it. And then the government can then respond by either prosecuting people for fraud, or what's most likely during this period is that they're going to legitimize the fraud and say, okay, we're going to expand voting rights. That's exactly what New York State wound up doing.
Well, you got to think in such a young nation and coming from a system with like the monarchy that's very different at that time where you didn't have a lot of input necessarily. It was the small group of people in charge get to make the rules and everybody else just lives with it, where people in this new country, like they were trying to come up with better ways. It's just not all of those good ideas are going to happen at once.
Well, and the fundamental lesson of the revolution or of any big social movement is that when the government isn't allowing you to live your life in a way that enables you to survive or doesn't make sense, then you learn to work outside the government. That's something that is at the heart really of the Southwest and the Four Corners. We do things all the time that maybe isn't exactly kosher with the laws that we're supposed to follow. How many people have exchanged house cleaning services in exchange for daycare and not reported that to the IRS? That's technically illegal, but this goes on all the time, and the government, by and large, allows people to do that, or at least doesn't make a big deal out of it. Because at the end of the day, government has to enable people to live their lives. And when government does not do that, then we'll move around it, or in some cases, we'll hold an entire revolution and expel the government because we're just sick of putting up with it. In the case of the revolutionaries who carried out this huge political upheaval, a lot of it was that they were not allowed to do the economic activity that they believed was best for the country. And there's a lot of other historians who talk very legitimately about how northern colonial interests just wanted to make more money, they wanted more liberal trade laws, and that's also true too. People can have a noble intention, people can have a practical intention, and people can have kind of a nefarious intention at the exact same time, because we are nothing if not a nation of contradictions. These contradictions exist within the same people at the same time. That's one of the things I actually kind of love about America, is this sort of internal chaos that rules our lives.
Going through a very interesting political time period. It really showcases where you can have this hierarchy of motivations and needs and a lot of different approaches about how to make those changes. But it's interesting to see how much of what we still see today was happening on a grander scale in the 1700s, where you're completely just trying to rebuild a society along with a nation and a government and a social system and everything that needed to go into it. And nobody's going to do it exactly right the first time. It's interesting reading through this and seeing, especially for me, like I'm not a historian, but you kind of have this overall grander kind of concept of history and how things went. And you've got like the basics. And that's a lot of what you learn, I think, through middle school and high school. You kind of get the surface level, but then you actually see some of the day-to-day stuff, like what you have in the book. It's like, oh gosh, like this was so much messier. Some of the parts where you're talking about, like, hardly anybody even had shoes. Some people didn't even have pants.
It may surprise those of you in the audience who go out and read the book. You can purchase it off of Amazon, quick plug, or you can come into the San Juan College library and I'll sell you a paperback copy for $10, which is a lot cheaper than what you can get it off Amazon. So some of you who may read the book might be surprised to see that one of the heroes in this story is Benedict Arnold. You know, Benedict Arnold famously betrayed West Point, or attempted to, tried to turn it over to the British, and was caught through Washington's excellent spy network. And he became persona non grata. There are cadets at West Point who were named Benedict or Arnold, and they changed their names legally because they didn't want to be associated with him. But Benedict Arnold was pushed to make those decisions because the Continental Army and the Continental Congress, all of these people, were abusing him terribly, taking advantage of him, exploiting his gifts, and refusing to give him any acknowledgement. And anybody who has seen the musical Hamilton will recall that there's warnings by some of the representatives that said, you know, if we continue to refuse to acknowledge Benedict Arnold and refuse to acknowledge what a genius this guy is, then we are going to suffer for it. And there's going to be problems down the road. Again, that goes back to people taking actions that allow them to live their lives. And Benedict Arnold had sacrificed so much of his personal fortune, his political fortune, and he was at every turn getting insulted for it by the Continental Congress. And this is one of those examples. The Idiot Who Saved America is the story of Hanyost Schuyler. He was described as deranged, half mad. Today we would call him possibly mentally ill, neurodiverse. But what we do know is that he was just different. The Hanyost Schuyler family, which included his parents, his siblings, they had been accepted by the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, or the Iroquois Confederacy, as most people are accustomed to learning about them. But in the book, I like to use a nation's own names. I'm an enrolled Choctaw myself. You know, my husband is Potawatomi. We always like to use Chautauqua or Nishnabek as names for our nation. So that's one of the reasons why that's different in the book. But the Hanyost Schuylers, had long been accepted by this community. He had been accepted because he was different. That's why he had chosen to ally with the Loyalists, is because they allowed him to live, essentially. They allowed his family to be safe, and that is such a huge motivator. Even before this whole Loyalist versus Patriot thing rose up, they had accepted Juan for who he was, and in fact believed that he was something very special. So Benedict Arnold happened upon Juan Schuyler, whose family had been seized by the Tryon County Militia. The Tryon County Militia was going to execute his family because they were living with the Mohawk or the Seneca or the Oneida, and so that made them traitors to the Patriot cause. And it was really for no other reason than this was essentially a massive civil war. We talk about the American Civil War being brother against brother. This was everybody against everybody. So Benedict Arnold saw this man, and he thought, this is an opportunity. Brilliant strategist. Daniel Lee, by the way, who the book was about, Daniel Lee wound up being picked to serve under this detachment to go into Tryon County to try and bust up what was called the Siege of Fort Stanwix or the Siege of Fort Schuyler. It was certainly a suicide mission, which is one of the reasons why they sent Benedict Arnold to do it, because it was a really great way of getting Benedict Arnold in this detachment out of everybody's hair. And he's probably going to die, or at least be captured, and then they get rid of somebody that they don't like. Bonus. So Benedict Arnold finds Juan Schuyler begging for his life from the Tryon County Militia while his weeping mother and his incredibly scared brother look on, and he thinks this guy is trusted. He is trusted by the tribes that are allied with the British. And he immediately thinks, okay, I'm going to tell this guy, hey, Juan Yost, I will save your life. But in exchange, you have to go through every single camp that you see. And you have to tell everybody that you see that we have a massive detachment heading towards Fort Schuyler. And the numbers become super inflated, just like a game of telephone. It goes from person to person to person, camp to camp to camp. It grows beyond Juan Yost. Because people, even if they don't quite buy it, because they know that Juan Yost is a little bit funny in the head, as they would say, they decide it makes a good story. And they think, well, what if it is true? So as Juan Yost goes through the camps, he put his clothes up against a tree and shot his clothes full of holes to sell the story. So actually quite smart. And he's telling people, oh yeah, Benedict Arnold has 500 artillery. He has all these cavalry. He has so many soldiers, and they're heading up to Fort Schuyler to challenge the British. And then those people that he tells, they say, well, we don't want any part of that. Yeah, we're allied with the British, but we're really in favor of ourselves and the preservation of our nation. So they decide to pack up and leave. And then as they're packing up and leaving, they run across the next camp. And they say, oh yeah, we're leaving because there's this huge detachment of patriots heading right toward Fort Schuyler. And we don't want any part of that. And then that camp packs up and leaves. So there's a stream eventually of half of the Confederacy heading north to safety in Canada. And they're passing by the British forces who are besieging Fort Schuyler. And they say, oh yeah, Benedict Arnold is heading up with 2,000 cavalry and infantry and artillery, and we've seen it with our own eyes. And so they leave. And then the British forces, finally, Juan Schuyler gets to them, and he gets a personal audience with St. Leger, who's the British commander. And he says, yes, I was personally taken captive by Benedict Arnold, and then I escaped. And he has 2,000 cavalry and all of these people, all of these infantry. And St. Leger isn't completely buying it, but he's not buying it either. Mm-hmm. So just to be safe, he packed up and left. And just like that, the British campaign, making inroads into what became New York State, collapsed. And they left in such a hurry that they left supplies behind. So Benedict Arnold rolls up to Fort Schuyler, where the Patriots had been on their last ropes and had vowed to fight to the death. And Benedict Arnold rolls up, and Juan Yost is sitting there, and he says, all right, they're gone. And there's all these supplies. Not only has he gotten the British to flee, which was probably unintended, but he's now ensured Benedict Arnold's detachment would have supplies. They were on the ropes themselves, just as a detachment. So it really couldn't have turned out better. And then Benedict Arnold releases the Schuyler family, and then they all beat it up to Canada to go wait out the rest of the war. So one of the things that I like about Daniel Lee as a person is that when he applied for his pension later on in the 1820s, he was old, he had been injured in the war, and those injuries, they eventually add up. And so he applied for his pension, and he got a lot of the details wrong, which happens a lot. But the one thing he remembered, even though Benedict Arnold was, at this point, one of history's greatest villains in the United States, he proudly remembered serving under that detachment. That was the defining moment of his entire military career.
being under the command of someone who took these unusual tactics was not, compared to some of the others that are mentioned, who seemed to treat his men well overall and have concern and compassion on some level, trying to accomplish those goals without always some of the collateral damage that goes along with some of these campaigns, that the men who are in the middle of all of that are going to see it very differently than the people on the outside. People changing their names to get rid of Benedict or Arnold to distance themselves. You're seeing that from the outside, from the end result of how things turned out at the end, and not taking into account everything that led up to that. Whereas you get someone like Daniel Lee, who was a part of not everything, but a lot of that journey leading to Arnold's eventual betrayal. I thought that that was an interesting part to highlight because it shows how much perspective matters when you're making a judgment on something. There was a lot throughout this that kind of just popped up, these little mini lessons that it's like, oh, I still see a lot of that today. Our society still struggles with these same things. You had a section where you're talking about how the Indigenous people were treated by the military on both sides and how they were looked at as not human, really. Not to the level of like they had rights, they needed to be treated with a certain level of respect. If it was a white lady who was raped, we're going to go in and court-martial and we're going to deal with that. But so much of how the Indigenous people were treated, it was just like, well, let's move on. And how long that has persisted into current society. Obviously, not to that level today, thankfully, but we still see some of those remnants of those attitudes. And even how the military tract that they set up was land that had been part of a treaty to the different tribes, and we're still going to do whatever we want. And just seeing where those thoughts and perspectives started and where we've gotten to today, but where some of that work is still needed.
The betrayal of these nations. This is the origin of United States legal policy towards how it's going to treat Indigenous people. The Indigenous people are deliberately classed as children, that they're children to be managed, or they're classed as part of the wilderness. You would no more give a deer voting rights back then than you would give an Indigenous person. But they do this even though it's inherently contradictory, because there are people who are patriots who are part or wholly Indigenous as well, who get voting rights, who become legitimized because they're not living within that community. And then there's Oneida, who were, again, for themselves more than they were for the Patriots or the Loyalists. And the Oneida would do things like be contracted to make moccasins so that the soldiers in the Continental Army would have shoes. And they were cast with the same suspicion after the war that the Mohawk were. It didn't matter that the Oneida had themselves, at great personal risk, decided to support the Continental Army. They were shuffled off to the military tract and then to that reservation system that we know so well in the Four Corners. And they were abused and exploited and then eventually dispossessed the exact same way as the Mohawk and the Cayuga. And then the United States decided to put all of these soldiers and veterans onto that land in the hopes that they would essentially serve as a civilian army. People forget with the narratives of the brave settlers going westward to, farm this new land. That was an occupied war zone. In the Homestead Act, the settlers were essentially being used as human shields against legitimate nations who had been living on that land and weren't terribly happy about it. This whole settlers versus Indians, Kevin Costner just came out with his movie that's brave, noble settlers versus the Mescalero Apache in Arizona. But that was the whole point of it. We can have soldiers, and we don't have to pay them. And if they die, well, then they become part of the great myth arc of the United States. The John Gast painting, American Progress, with Columbia sweeping over the nation and expelling the Native Americans, and then behind her are the brave settlers. This book is the beginning of all of that. And it's all about creating basically a civilian army that's comprised of family. And their function is to remove the wilderness, to rob the land of the food that Indigenous nations depend upon, to force them westward so that they create conflicts with other nations, which immediately started happening within the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. That's what the concept of the frontier is really about. making land safe, largely for speculators. Speculators aren't going to go deep into the frontier and risk their families and risk their lives for land. But if you convince a settler that they should do it because it's part of who they are as an American, then you don't even have to pay them.
It's interesting how much of the early years, especially, how much of that was myth. What was put out to the people, what continues to even still be in history books today, is not accurate, but also not a lot of times necessarily the real intentions, the real motivations. It's been almost kind of Disney-fied in a lot of ways.
Pocahontas with the little raccoon.
Yeah,
buddy, you know.
it's not realistic. And I thought it was really interesting. We went to Mesa Verde National Park a couple months back and sat and watched the video. And I've been there many times over my life, but it had been a long time since I'd gone in and seen the video that they usually show. And it was a new video. And it was interesting that it has taken this long for them to change that video to say, yeah, a lot of the stuff that's been taught, not accurate. The people who lived in Mesa Verde didn't mysteriously disappear. There's all these myths attached to that. What do you mean? Where did they go? Like they moved on. Like we're still here. Like the people in this area are descended from the tribes who moved through here and who built the cliff dwellings. But that was the myth. That was what I learned in school growing up.
Yeah, I saw on Twitter somebody's child had gotten a worksheet at school, this is like second grade, that said, "Where did the Native Americans live?" And he wrote, "We're still here."
So much of that still persists today.
The larger nation to which the Choctaw belong, they're in Oklahoma, and another nation lived on that land before they were told to go to Oklahoma. My husband's Potawatomi people, his direct ancestors, founded what is now Chicago. And his nation lives in Oklahoma. It's all about being pushed to create conflicts between nations. If you can shove everybody off of the military tract in New York, and you can shove them northward to Canada so that they can go and fight these other people for you, and then you can shove part of them westward into what is now Ohio and western Pennsylvania, and then they'll go and fight these other people for you, because these are also sovereign nations in their own right. That's one of the ways in which I bring my international relations background to that historical analysis, is that I think what was missing for a long time in histories that talk about Indigenous people but are not themselves Indigenous centered is the idea that these are sovereign nations in their own right with their own approaches to foreign policy. So when the Cayuga are sitting down at the table with the Mohawk, that is an international summit. And it has to be analyzed in the same way as we would analyze talks between France and England. And I think we don't do that as a field very often in history. One of my previous books is used in the state of Colorado in the schools. And it's a foreign policy and international economics analysis of the activity around Bent's Fort, which I treat as essentially an oasis of international negotiations, and treat William Bent himself as somebody who was a diplomat, who was managing relations between a huge number of nations who each had their own interests and would meet at places like Bent's Fort to try to reach peace accords. It's a place where people could meet, a place of impartiality and neutrality, which the United States Army very much disliked. And so they attempted to take it over. And this is in the previous book. It's actually available for free in the state of Colorado. It's an examination of all these documents that tell this larger story of how this border that we live south of now was a place of huge international significance. Because if we talk about it as an international border, Farmington itself exists in an international border. We have the Navajo Nation. We have the United States Nation. We have the Hickory Apache Nation. We have the Southern Ute Nation. We have the Mountain Ute Nation. All of these different people who all represent different nations coming together at this place. And we don't really think of it like that. So that's something that when I stumbled upon this story of Daniel Lee's, remember the book is about him, and I look at what the 1st New York Regiment and his particular detachment would do when they were launching ambush attacks against the Onondaga and committing what Washington himself would have considered a war crime against their women. That would be something that would be consistent with his philosophy. But when they're doing something like that, it's not just a war crime, it is an international incident. And it does actually create a significant international incident when you look at the reaction of the Mohawk choosing to expel the Oneida, essentially, from the Confederacy, because the Oneida were loosely allied with the same force that committed the war crime. And war crime is not a modern term by any means. So when I looked at, well, what would Washington have really thought about this? He was very consistent in his attitudes towards what war crimes against women would be like. He quotes Hugo Grotius, who is a 15th century scholar who looked at just war theory, and he wrote a lot during the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, about the role of war crimes and how armies are meant to treat civilians and women. It was something to which he wasn't just a military tactician or a military strategist who went and played with little dolls on a map, the sort of the image of the military tactician. He thought deeply about the philosophy of war and how actions during war by certain troops are perceived by the public and how vital it was to control the narrative, but also to try not to do things that piss people off. When General Gus Van Schack reported the war crime against the Onondaga women, that Daniel Lee's unit, possibly not Daniel Lee himself, we don't know that. When this was reported to Washington, the Central Command disagreed with the actions themselves, but politically they had no interest in actually prosecuting it. So we can see, it's easy to excuse actions of the past, I think, by saying, well, back in the day, that was the standard. Back in the day, slavery was acceptable. Back in the day, sexual assault against women was acceptable. So we can give these people a pass. It wasn't acceptable. If we actually look at what people thought, if we look at what leadership thought, it's just that people's actions are often completely contradictory to what they actually wind up doing. When Washington very strictly disagrees with British use of rape as a war crime, and even disagrees with what the 1st New York Regiment under Captain Graham did to the Onondaga women, it doesn't mean he's going to take action on it. We only have so much energy and so much capacity and political capital to fight battles. You look at the modern day excusing of slavery from these people by saying that back in the day, that was the prevailing opinion, was that slavery was okay. If you could go onto a plantation and it was a plantation of 99 slaves and one master, and you went around and took a poll of, are you okay with this? Probably a good 95% of that plantation would not be okay with slavery. The people who are victimized and oppressed are allowed to have an opinion on their victimization and oppression. When I read about what happened to the Onondaga women, I really took pains to look up what the Mohawk leaders and the Onondaga leaders, what they themselves said about it, what the British said about this, and even what Washington himself said about this. And it was consistent across the board that this was an awful thing that they did. And it had huge repercussions to how invested the rest of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy were now in defeating the Patriots. I mean, this abandoned any hope that the Mohawk in particular were going to be just for themselves. Now they were for themselves, and they were also against the Patriots. So that is an international incident. So I like to apply those analyses. Look at just war theory. Look at our philosophy towards what's acceptable in warfare and what's acceptable in society. Who are we actually asking?
Well, I think that's the value of books like this that take a really realistic, critical look at history and not just tell the story in a storytelling way. The challenges and the achievements, and it all turned out the way you thought it did, because there's so much more to it than that. And I think we could probably dive into a lot more of this for a lot more time, but we are out of time already. You have tons of sources that you mentioned in the back, piecing all of this together through so many documents to share what it was like for a soldier in the Revolutionary War, what that was like for them, and where some of the things that we're still working against today in perceptions and ideas and how people are treated, where some of that came from. And I think that helps give people a better perspective of, is this right? Should we be thinking that? What do we need to change? We've come this far, but can we work to keep improving this where we're at?
And how do we decide what kind of nation and what kind of people we really want to be?
Because it's not static, it's still changing. And we're at a pivotal point, I think, right now in where the country will go on certain topics and directions. So,
can I say the phrase unprecedented times?
I think that's applicable, yeah.
It's all precedented in the fact that it's unprecedented.
Well, I want to remind our listeners before we close up, the book is called Daniel Lee and the Idiot Who Saved America by Jennifer Goodland. And Jennifer, where can people find you and the book?
People can find the book on Amazon. They can also come to the San Juan College Library, and I'll give you a deal.
Good
and
deal.
I'll even sign it.
Well, thank you so much for coming in and chatting with me today. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.